Queen Matilda of Flanders, overshadowed by her more famous granddaughter of the same name, was atypical for a woman of her time. She had immense sway, refusing to be cowed by her often violent Norman husband. She was more than just the wife of the conqueror. She was one of the most influential and powerful women in Europe. And this is her story. In the year 1068, Matilda must have felt on top of the world. She's only in her 30s, and for the past 2 years, she's been enjoying her position as the Queen of England. Her marriage to William the Conqueror, which she originally rejected, was paying its dividends. She was also Regent of Normandy when William was away, though currently she was in England with William, allowing her son Robert Curthose to hold the reins of regent for a while. Matilda had also given birth to 8 healthy children, for at this moment Henry was yet to be born. In an era where many young women won't survive childbirth, and many won't live into their 30s. Take in mind that if there were complications during pregnancy, things like hemorrhaging, they could be fatal. And there were no epidurals either, or no scans. It was very much in fate's hands. No wonder women had a churching ceremony where prayers and rites were said post-birth, and time given for the women to heal. Not that Matilda had time for any of that. She's doing very well. Forever the stateswoman. She's built quite the brood, her last child being Henry, and he's born on British soil. Now, last episode I teased Henry's birth and his future, but in the summer following the coronation was the birth proper. Now, Matilda had tried to give birth up north in York, but nature had other plans, and the baby was born in Selby. And I will say at once that she had only decided to head up north because it was supposedly pacified. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of the North, were at the coronation. The kingdom was finally getting less chaotic, though it would take some time before it would truly feel like home. Yet here was more talk of rebellion. And no sooner had the heavily pregnant Matilda begun her journey north, trouble erupted. A trouble that had started brewing in the north of England following the coronation. Edwin and Morcar were rebelling, and once again, Edgar the Atheling was stirring up his claim to the English throne, from the comfort of Scotland, of course. In response, William the Conqueror headed up north with an army, intent on squashing this rebellion before it had begun, which worked. He arrived in York in the summer of 68. If he would have arrived just 1 year later, he would have interrupted a famous Bryan Adams song. No, but in all seriousness, William made his way to York, and on the way he bolsters the spine of his kingdom, reinforcing strategic strongholds and building new ones. He ordered the building of many castles, including Lincoln, mostly Motte and Bailey, and each one a statement, a sign of dominance. Wooden affairs that were quick to build and well defended. This was a new wave of castle building. Each of these strongholds received a well-oiled garrison, entrusted to his loyal soldiers and his many mercenaries. These new castles in the Midlands would also cut off Edwin and Morcar from their Welsh allies, tipping the scales in favour of the Normans. As soon as news reached them that Warwick Castle was under construction, Edwin and Morcar immediately sued for peace, and were pardoned. But there were still other rebels further north, beyond the Humber and towards York. Then the king arrived in York, at the head of his army, putting down local resistance, the old Roman walls proving no match for the Norman war machine, and all rebels were sent fleeing to the local hills. Job done. While he subdued the local rebels, William needed a stronghold here in the city. To do so, he cleared an area between the Foss River and the River Ouse. Thousands upon thousands of homes were destroyed according to the Domesday Book. In their place was built a Motte Bailey, which would one day become York Castle. In charge of Yorkshire were placed men like William Mallet and Gilbert de Ghent, possibly even William de Warenne, men that controlled the castles and cities that made up the backbone of the kingdom. But as for Matilda, she had cut her journey short and given birth to Henry in Selby. Still, the trouble wasn't all that far away, which wouldn't have put anyone's mind at ease. Plus, Selby was a far cry from York. As for exactly why Matilda stopped in Selby, it could have been the threat of rebellion, but equally it could have been labour. Because politically, the talk of rebellion had been quashed by now. All things have returned back to normal, for the most part. Like I said, I teased most of this in the last video about Henry's birth, and I'm only focusing now on Henry because of his importance to British history. But it's not like Matilda would have known that Henry would ever become a future king, as is the fourth boy. He's not even a spare. Currently, the heir apparent is Robert Curthose, who is in his late teens, and back in Normandy he's currently acting as regent. Even though he doesn't have a good relationship with his father, he is very much the mother's boy. You also have Richard. He's in his early teens. He's currently in England with his mother, though we don't know if he's headed north or not. Most likely he remains in Winchester with everybody else. With him was most likely his 8-year-old brother, William, who was also known as Rufus due to his ruddish hair. So from now, I'll be referring to young William simply as Rufus, so we can distinguish between William the Conqueror and his son. And yes, he was also a king of England. Matilda of Flanders is pretty much the mother of kings. Oh, you got the water roll on me head. Anyway, not long after the birth, Matilda made baby Henry the heir to all her lands in England, at least according to the chronicler Oderic. Even in an age where many babies don't make it into childhood, she still seems to have done this. And Henry is very much doted on by both his parents, but is not looking at an aristocratic life. He'll most likely be pushed into a career in the church. And at this point, there was no chance he'd ever see a throne. And as praise to God to help deliver a healthy boy, William and Matilda founded a Benedictine abbey at Selby, which would start construction the next year. Henry would be given the best education out of all the boys, enjoying the tutelage of Zumiez, the Archbishop of Canterbury, learning Latin, English, and becoming a shrewd thinker. He is given the nickname Beauclerc, which simply means fine scholar. So he must have been learned. But all that is getting ahead of ourselves, because we're in, still, 1068. William had just subdued the north, and the rest of the kingdom is slowly returning back to normal. Though when I say normal, I mean normal for an invading conqueror who's hated by the majority. But he's hated less in York than London, so a win's a win. Because the Londoners were extremely hostile to the new king and queen. They hated them. To subdue London, William had to construct a fortress, the famous and often infamous Tower of London. And in case you're wondering, how on earth could the royal couple live and rule a capital that hated them? Well, London wasn't the capital it is today. That would be established later. Right now, Winchester is the capital. That's the Saxon capital. And I'll quickly mention that wily old Edward the Confessor had given the palace there to his wife Edith, and neither Matilda nor William wanted to start a quarrel with her. So simply built a new palace down the road. Bigger and better. Much more luxurious than before. By the end of 1068, the kingdom looked safe enough for the royal couple to travel back over the Channel to their home in Normandy. There they'd spend the Christmas with the Norman aristocracy in Rouen. People and customs they were far more familiar with. And in the north, the Earl of Northumbria, a Saxon troublemaker called Gospatrick, was replaced by Robert de Comines, who had a garrison of just under 1,000 men. Finally, it looked like things might settle down. Hopefully peace would last. Boy, they were wrong. No sooner had Matilda and William returned to Normandy, Edgar Atheling had gathered an army, leaving Scotland and marching them into Northumbria. William now faced a full-scale rebellion in the north. Robert de Comines, the new Earl of Northumbria, appears to have responded to this, heading an army of 700 men towards Durham. Only his forces are destroyed, the Earl himself killed. And the previous Earl, Gospatrick, is claiming the title once more. In February, allied with Edwin and Morcar, Edgar Atheling threw his forces upon the Norman defenders, taking the city of York and establishing a base. So once again, Matilda was left as regent of Normandy as her husband raced off to England at the head of an army, descending upon the north like a lion, taking York swiftly and without error, sending his enemies scattering once again to the hills. There, in York, William Fitz-Osbern was put in charge of things, and Gilbert de Ghent was made castellan of the castle. Competent men, loyal to the king. Also in York, a second castle was built, as clearly one was not enough. In case you were wondering, Matilda was not absent from this, though she had no part in the fighting, for she had also arrived in England, crossing the Channel in the spring of 1069, once again leaving Robert Curthose as regent. Her leaving Normandy was a strange decision, as William was facing one hell of a rebellion, one that could have bolstered his enemies on the continent, enemies that could have easily have overpowered Robert Curthose and his advisors. She took her second son, Richard, with her. If anything, this is a testament to Matilda's ability to control the region, as she proceeded to work her political arts in England's south, most likely fearing a counter-rebellion from places like Exeter and London. Should the south rise up, the Normans would have a real fight on their hands. William needed Matilda more than ever, and the Queen immediately got to work, keeping up her good relations with carefully planned meetings and councils, making sure the Curia Regis, the governing body there, was firmly behind the king. Religious festivals were a good tool here. So Easter was spent at Winchester, and the Queen made it as lavish as possible, keeping everybody unified. Whitsun would be at Wells, as she witnessed a charter to the cathedral there, and Christmas was planned for Gloucester. During each, Matilda was acted as the housekeeper, the seneschal. It would have been her, as always, that kept things in order, making sure the correct people sat at the high table, booking the entertainment, and making sure her famous hospitality was top tier. And of course, making sure the food was fully stocked, and the wine was overflowing. The aim was to impress. This was traditionally the Queen's role back then, one of their duties. As for the rebellion, it was over by then, job done. William retreats south to Nottingham, but he knew the rebels were far from defeated, and he was probably on edge, as the king seemed determined to undermine Matilda's efforts to keep the kingdom from falling apart. I'll give an example of this. While he's at the Easter celebrations, dealing with a property grant with the Holy Trinity Church, something highly important, while handing over a knife to the abbot there, Rayner, he lurches forward as if to stab the poor guy. Given William's reputation of cruelty, this little prank probably scared the life out of Abbot Rayner. And we know Matilda witnessed this, as her signature is on the grant. It was probably her that mended the relations after her husband's idiocy. This is behaviour more akin to Caligula than a King of England. But once again, rebellion stirs in the north. The rebels were far from defeated. They still had Gospatrick, the Earl of Northumberland. They still had Edwin and Morcar, Eadric the Wild. They still had Edgar Atheling. He's only in Scotland, under the protection of the Scottish King Malcolm III. They still had the Godwin family, who have left Flanders to ally with the Danish king, Svein Estrithson. The rebellion is far from over. The Danes still considered the north theirs, and Sven had been a fourth contender for the English throne originally. He's the grandson of Sven Forkbeard, a true old-school Viking. Estrithson puts his support behind Edgar Atheling and the rebels. Then, once he had gathered enough forces, the Danish king launches his invasion fleet of around 300 ships, invading the English coast in the autumn. His army of Norsemen crashing down upon the Normans, raiding the towns as they headed north towards the Humber, plundering as they went like the Vikings of old. There they met up with the rebel armies, swiftly retaking York. More than 3,000 Normans were killed, Both castles were fallen. By the time the Conqueror threw his forces towards the Humber, the Danes had abandoned York, and they were resting in Lincolnshire. Knowing they had no chance against the king, they were resorting to hit-and-run tactics, as were the rebels. This had descended into a guerrilla war. The south was also rising up, as were the Cornish, as were the Welsh. William's reign seemed over. As all hell broke loose, Matilda was sent back to Normandy, for England was far too dangerous, and from Normandy all she could do was pray. But there was probably another reason for her to be sent back to Normandy, as although the domain there was stable, there was trouble brewing on the borders, along with the usual bit of eternal squabbling. Her trusty advisers were Roger de Beaumont and Jean of Avranches. He's the Archbishop of Rouen at this point. Two powerful men from two of the three estates that made up the Norman feudal system. Matilda immediately got to work with the administration of the domain, sorting out affairs between various peoples. Now, I'll give you an example of Matilda's growing power in court, for all you unbelievers who think I'm inflating her abilities and influence. Right. There's a matter in the church that needed settling. Saint-Martin in Montmoutier, in the past, had been given an income from the king in form of grants, all above board, all cushy. However, now, well, the new Vicomte Robert Bertrand was hogging all the money for himself. The church abbey was not seeing a penny. So a monk, Jocelyn, fed up with all of this, heads off to England to get the king's final word on the matter. And what does William do? He tells him to bugger off and bring the matter to his wife Matilda. It's her job to deal with it. There you go. And he would do this to anyone undercutting a queen and bugging him with all the politics while he was away. She was regent after all, not him. And with Robert Bertrand, let's just say that the money went back to the church. But with the borders, things were not good in Maine, which had broken out in a rebellion around then. Just 6 years prior, they were subdued by King William, they were conquered, and Geoffrey Mayenne was heading his rebels in a bid to break free from the conquering Normans. Not long after Matilda's arrival, Le Mans had also fallen to the rebels. Worse was to come, as the King of France, Philippe I, and the Duke of Brittany had joined forces and were preparing a full-scale invasion into Normandy. Now, the previous Duke of Brittany, Conan II, died under very suspicious circumstances. As I explained in a previous video, he was poisoned after no showing in 1066. His sister, Hawise, had inherited the Duchy of Brittany, and by jure uxoris, her husband, Hoel, is now the Duke, and he's looking for some payback on the Normans. The situation was serious. Matilda now had a real fight on her hands. And the Norman military forces had been heavily depleted, having been sent to reinforce the campaign in England. Naturally, Matilda's first reaction was to request aid to her husband, who was still quelling the rebellion, from Edgar Atheling. All the king could do is send a retinue of troops, led by William of Poitiers, the son of William Osborne, the Earl of Herefordshire. This was not good news. A warrior, Matilda was not. But before we continue with that, we've got to head back to England for what happens next. Because William had no intention of fighting a guerrilla war with the rebels, letting them stage hit-and-run strikes like the rats they were. He planned to flush them out and eradicate them once and for all. Firstly, William opted to bribe the Danes, who simply took the money, before abandoning their Saxon and Scottish allies, heading for their ships and sailing back home. And now William turned his attention to the rebels hiding in the hills. And what happened next was nothing short of a war crime. But the North needed to be taught a lesson in William's eyes. And this was the 11th century, not the 21st. Though even for the 11th century, the harrowing was cruel, as the king understood years later when he finally repented. If, in 1066, the Saxons thought William's sacking of villages was bad, they ain't seen nothing yet. From the Humber to the Tees, William exacted terrible revenge, a scorched earth policy that ravaged the North. Men, women, children, innocent or rebel. The killing was indiscriminate. Thousands were slain, untold in number. The Normans razed the North to the ground. Eyewitnesses would describe this in detail as it scarred them for life. Such horror imprinted on their minds. The helpless children, the youth cut down in their prime, the greybeards just as wretched as the others. No one was safe. The famine that followed was the final nail in the coffin, and just as many died from starvation as the fields were burned, cattle were slaughtered. The smoke from burning villages could be seen for miles. The stench of burning flesh from human and animal was inescapable. Refugees fled William's vengeance, but to where? The North was in ruin. Many fled south. The Abbey of Evesham recorded receiving a starving multitude. However, it was too late for some, and others, they ate the food they were given so quickly that they died anyway. A terrible event. And William would spend his Christmas in the ruins of York, apparently wearing his crown as a statement of his power. And there was no doubt he was in charge. But it would eat at his soul for years, until he finally repented later in life. And the harrying of the North remains one of the darkest events in British history. While William was unleashing hell in England, Matilda seems to have been holding her own against her enemies in Normandy, as the situation is still dragging on well into the next year. Frustratingly, so little is written about the period from late 1069 until mid-1070, as all eyes are on England, even though in the autumn of 69, Matilda is facing off a huge crisis on the borders. There is no mention of Matilda being present at her husband's second coronation in Easter either, so she must have still been in Normandy. We do know that by 1070, all Norman troops had been driven out of Maine. The rebels, satisfied with independence, go no further, and Matilda has no intention of taking back the territory. She doesn't have the troops to spare. And we know Maine will remain under the control of the rebels until several years later, when William turns up and invades once again. that's in the future. But what is Brittany doing? What is France doing? Weren't they plotting an invasion? Well, sources say that France did launch an invasion. So is Matilda currently fighting skirmishes on the border? I doubt everybody's sitting around doing nothing. Well, one factor is probably the relationship between the French king and Matilda's mother, Adela. The rulers of Flanders and the French royals are very much related. King Philip I is Adela's nephew. He's Matilda's cousin. So given what we know about these two powerful women, Matilda and Adela, is it that much of a stretch to assume that diplomacy has stalled the fighting? Plus, King Philip of France is only in his late teens. The current Count of Flanders is his cousin, Baldwin VI, Matilda's brother. It's a family squabble. So it makes sense that this is dealt with as a family matter. Right. No correspondence between Matilda and her mother exists. But this doesn't mean to say that it didn't occur. Because since the wedding, back in, 1050? For example, since the wedding, back around 1050, there is also no evidence of her ever contacting her mother, and vice versa. But this clearly happened. These are, after all, the murky depths of history. A few sources survive as it is. Right. Without Philip, the Bretons, led by Hawise and Hoel, probably wouldn't stand a chance against Normandy, so most likely thought better of invasion. Seems to be the logical way of looking at it. What we do know is that in mid-July 1070, everything is kicking off again. But not from France, Maine or Brittany. No, from Flanders. You see, there was a tragedy with Matilda's family back in her homeland. Her brother, Baldwin, had died suddenly, leaving his son Arnulf as the sole ruler. But the problem is, Arnulf is a teenager who hasn't yet reached his majority, and his ambitious mother, Rechildis, is required to step in as regent. And this does not bode well for the other brother, Robert the Frisian. He immediately rises up in rebellion against his young nephew, intent in stealing Flanders for himself. Oh, there's more, because Robert the Frisian, so called because he's married the Countess of Frisia, has dragged the German Emperor into this. This time, there would be no diplomacy. Once again, Matilda writes to her husband. But William is unwilling to get involved in what he perceives is a family squabble in Flanders. Like before, he sends a small retinue out of respect for his wife, and that's it. Oh, and by small, according to Malmesbury, a chronicler contemporary to the time, it was only 10 knights. Though they were led by the king's number one guy, the best knight in the kingdom, William Fitz-Osbern. And apparently, again, according to Malmesbury, only because Fitz-Osbern rather fancied marrying the widow Rechildis. The scallywag! Oh, in case you're wondering, he's single. His wife, Adeliza, having died relatively recently. So if you're going to remarry, go big, marry a countess. So, Fitz-Osbern heads to Flanders to aid the Rechildis in crushing Robert's rebellion. But another chronicler, Jumièges, claims that it was Matilda who instigated Fitz-Osbern's journey to Flanders, and he headed a large army. So who to believe, Malmesbury or Jumièges? One chap is certainly telling porkies. Well, the best way to look at it is by ascertaining the situation over in England, as William is in no position to give up troops. He's fighting yet another rebellion. Again, Edwin and Morcar are playing cat and mouse and proving to be a right pest. And also, according to Ralph of Coggeshall in the Chronicon Anglicanum, Malcolm, the King of Scotland, is also ravaging the north of England at this point in time. So King William is in no position to give Matilda any military support. I will also add that Fitz-Osbern didn't appear to take any of this seriously and heads off as if going to a tournament. Whatever the case, Fitz-Osbern joined with Count Arnulf in Flanders, most likely Calais, and their forces were considerable, easily outnumbering Robert of Frisian's own army. Adding to this, Adela of France persuaded King Philip of France to aid Arnulf also. It was looking good. But Robert moved quickly, not giving Arnulf nor Fitz-Osbern the time to properly assemble, and not waiting for the French to arrive. Instead, the Frisian met Arnulf at nearby Cassel. The Norman Flemish forces still outnumbered Robert's army, but not that it mattered. The result was a total disaster. Robert crushed them, driving them from the field, utterly annihilating them. And Count Arnulf didn't last long, slain in the battle. Worse, King William's own best knight, Fitz-Osbern, was slain with him, along with his men. Robert the Frisian was now the undisputed Count of Flanders. But the biggest blow to Matilda would happen during this period, as back in England, King William had been marking out various forests for the purpose of hunting. He's the one who introduces the forestry laws that would become a staple of medieval England. Naturally, areas like the New Forest become a popular place for the Norman nobility to hunt game like deer and wild boar. The royal son Richard loved to hunt in the New Forest. But one fateful day, and we don't know when, only that it was after 1069, and most likely between 1070 and 1072, that while galloping he caught his neck in the branch of a tree and was killed. He most likely died of his injuries. He was only in his mid-teens. He had a promising career as a nobleman. He hadn't even been knighted. Matilda was beside herself with grief, and the lad was laid to rest at Winchester Cathedral. And, in a strange twist of fate, another of Matilda's sons would also die in later years in a hunting accident in that very forest.